There was nothing remarkable or different about that Sunday. It was a typical grey and blustery November morning on the Isle of Wight. My husband Ed and I had been up for a little while, preparing breakfast and getting on with the usual Sunday chores in our family home on Woodvale Road in the village of Gurnard. Our youngest, 9-year-old Melissa, was already up and buzzing around the house, playing with her toys and watching cartoons. But as usual, our two sons, James, 12, and Damien, 16, were yet to surface from their bedrooms. I'd already heard James stirring, probably roused by the sound of the house coming to life, or perhaps the smell of breakfast cooking. But I hadn't heard a peep from Damien. No surprise, really. He'd been out the night before. I sent Melissa on a mission. "Go and wake Damien up," I said with a smile. Off she bounded, taking the stairs 2 at a time as she dashed past James, who was shuffling sleepily in the other direction. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. I hadn't even had time to say good morning before Melissa burst back into the room. "He's not in bed, Mum," she said, a confused expression evident on her face. "Damien's not in his room." "Are you sure?" I asked, frowning. "Is he in the bathroom, maybe?" Melissa shook her head. How strange, I thought, marching up the stairs. I hadn't heard him come in, but then his curfew was midnight, and I'd gone to bed before then. Ed had stayed up until almost 12, expecting him to come through the door any minute, but he'd nodded off too. It wasn't that he'd never come home later than we agreed, but he did always call me to let me know. "Damien," I called, just in case he was elsewhere in the house. No reply. Entering his room, it was clear he'd not been home. The sheets on his bed were still smoothed back neatly, and his pillows undented. His childhood teddy, Berry, was propped up in his usual place on the bed, alongside Woggle, a gangly stuffed dog that had previously belonged to his Auntie Sally. The new grey school trousers we'd bought while shopping in Newport the day before still hung on his cupboard door, and a stack of school textbooks was piled up on his desk. He told me he had a lot of studying to do before school on Monday. Even more reason that he should be home by now. In fact, scanning his room, everything was exactly as he'd left it when he'd hopped in his dad's car to get a lift over to his best friend, Chris Boone's house. That was at 7 p.m. He must still be there, I rationalised. What other explanation was there? They'd been going to a party over in East Cowes with Chris's younger brother Davy. He hadn't said, but I assumed there might have been alcohol there. We knew they occasionally sneaked a few ciders. I'd told Damien off for it in the past. He was tall for his age, and a handful of shops were a little lax when it came to checking ID, so of course they tried their luck. Maybe he'd had a few too many, ended up a little worse for wear. I could have called Chris there and then, but I looked at the clock. It was only 8:30 a.m. He was probably sleeping it off. There was every chance in the next hour or so we'd get a sheepish and hungover call from him, explaining his whereabouts. While my gut told me that something was amiss, I didn't want to overreact. At 16, Damien was still a child in our eyes, but we were also aware he was on the cusp of adulthood. We didn't want to cramp his style. "It is a Sunday," said Ed. "Let's wait a little longer to call." For the next 2 hours, I almost wore the carpet through, pacing around the house and looking out of the front window, hoping to see him walking up the path. Nothing. The anxiety began to wear me down as the minutes ticked by. Where was he? I stared and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. Still nothing. By the time late morning arrived, I couldn't take it any more. I grabbed the telephone and punched in Chris's number. The phone seemed to ring for an eternity before there was a click and I heard Chris's voice answer. "Hello?" he said. "Hello, Chris. It's Valerie, Damien's mum," I said, relief washing over me. Chris was home and awake, so Damien must be with him, I reasoned with myself. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Nettles," he said. I frowned. Did he sound surprised or nervous? I wondered if I might have caught him on the hop, if he knew Damien had stayed out late without our permission.